this video, we will continue to talk about rendering in 3D Studio Max. And in this case, we're going to talk about additional effects that we can obtain with the camera, and also about the motion blur that we can achieve with the animation. So in the previous videos, we saw how we can switch from day and night, how to use a single image and use the image-based lighting technique. So we switch from a single object to more complex scenes in exterior, and also in the interior rendering we saw how we can set up cameras to change the brightness or the darkness of the scene, and how we can adjust the exposure and other effects like the depth of field, so how you can place something in focus and something out of focus using the f number or f-stop value in the camera parameters. We also saw how we can create volumetric effects, volumetric light, using, in this case, an area light just placed outside the window, but you need to have like more direct lighting to create this effect. You can have something diffuse. You need to concentrate the light beam, and then you need to adjust the fog that we also see in the exterior. So you can use the fog either for exteriors and interiors, and if you set up the lights correctly, you're gonna have that beautiful and realistic volumetric light effect. So we're going to talk about animation in this video, but remember, if you want to see those effects that we are seeing, you can just open up the sample scenes and you will find volumetric lights, you will find motion blur, you will find depth of field, you will find any particular effects that you want to create, so you can study those sample scenes. Now, we talked about the camera exposure, which is going to be the physical representation and simulation of what happens in reality. So when we change the ISO and the aperture of the of our camera, of our shutter, and also the speed of our camera shutter, so the shutter speed, we're gonna affect the brightness of the scene. So we saw that with the depth of field, if we increase the aperture, we're going to have more depth of field but less light. Now, for the shutter speed, to create the motion blur, we need to have a slow shutter speed, a slow movement of the shutter. So that's going to cause the motion blur to happen, and it's also going to get more light into the scene. This is why often we can see the motion blur effect when we are at night and we take a picture. Usually things are more blurred, and you can see the motion blur because the shutter speed will go slow to capture more light, but also it's going to capture more movements. And we also saw other effects like the camera vignetting. We can always apply this. This is another effect due to the lens, to the camera, to the light getting to the cameras. And so we're gonna also add the camera parameters to the animation parameters. Now, animation stands on the FPS, which means frame per second. So an animation is composed by many images that are going to be displayed in a sequence, and you need to address this value first. So how fluid you want your animation to be. So the frame rate can be like 25 frame per second, or 24 frame per second, or 30 frame per second, or 100 frame per second. So this is going to affect the quality of the animation, but if you want to do something not too heavy, you can use 24 or 25 FPS. That's going to be like a medium value that you can use to have a good animation. Now remember that each frame represents a single rendering, so it means that to have 1 second of animation you need 24 or 25 renderings. So this is going to be really heavy for your computer. You need to have a powerful machine, a powerful PC to render high quality animation. Otherwise, you need to lower the quality of the rendering and also the quality of the animation. Now, don't go too low, like 12 frames per second. Otherwise, it's going to be not fluid. It's going to be like old movies, and it's not going to be great. It's going to look like stop motion animation. Well, if you want, you can do that if you want that effect. So the first really important term here is FPS, or frame rate. And again, just remember that an animation is just a series of renderings placed in sequence. So remember that if you need to do like 10 seconds of animation, you probably need to render like 250, 240 frames or rendering. So it's going to be a long process and really heavy. Now, all these frames can be considered either as keyframes or interpolation frames. So this is the other really important thing to know. So we are talking about frames to define an animation, and fortunately we don't need to create all the frames ourselves. Like in old school animation, they needed to create each single frame, for example, for animated cartoons. Now in our case, we just need to define keyframes and interpolation frames. Now I want to suggest you also a couple of tools here that you can use, like Lumion and Unreal Engine. These are excellent tools for animation. And also Twinmotion. You can create landscape design and really interesting animation easier. These are easier to use and faster to use, and you're gonna have like more interesting details, and everything is more optimized. But if you want to have the highest quality, you can use 3ds Max. You can use also V-Ray, other render engine. So let's proceed here. Let's go back to the keyframes. So again, we have keyframes and interpolation frames. You can see that example there. The red one is going to be like a keyframe, and then what happens in between the keyframes is going to be interpolation frame, meaning that it's going to be calculated by the computer. Then you have different types of interpolation depending on how your animation will be. If it's going to be like a smooth animation or if it's going to be like more mechanic movement. But the most important thing at first is going to be the keyframes. Keyframe are gonna define the essential movement or animation of your character, of your scene, of your camera. You can apply animation to anything. And then later you can change the interpolation. Usually the standard interpolation is smooth, so it's kind of a ease in, ease out setting. Okay, so let's get into our scene, which we use for exteriors and also for interiors. We have some nice natural light coming in. We have portal lights to enhance natural light. And also we added some artificial lights like spotlights. And we can use this now either as a night scene or a day scene. And this is the camera that we used in the previous video to set up the depth of field. So we have a focus point on the statue, and then we can always come back and adjust it. So if I want to create another camera now, I'm gonna just shift and move to create a copy, and I'm gonna use this to create the first animation. So we're gonna start with animating the camera, and we will see also the motion blur effect. So I don't want to create an instance here. I just want to create a copy so that we can modify one without affecting the original one. And I call this animation camera. So I'm gonna go in the view selection. I'm gonna go into cameras and select the animation camera. And this is again another physical camera. So we're gonna get into the shutter speed parameter because this is the one that we need to affect the motion blur effect, as we said. But also this is gonna change the exposure, so we need to balance then the exposure by addressing also the ISO and the f-stop, so the aperture of the shutter. So in case we want to have both depth of field and motion blur, we need to keep the aperture to a value about 1 or 2.